Hey guys, how are you all doing? So I didn't really get to make a reaction video to the 1.09 patch dropping out of nowhere. I've actually just been insanely busy lately with a company on-site week for my work, and then on top of that, I got a cat. So all of my free time has been spent trying to get this cat on my sleep schedule so that he doesn't wake me every hour meowing at me for attention. If you hear any noise in the background of this video, it's almost definitely my cat. Here's a picture of him. His name is Finn. Anyways, it's probably a good thing that I wasn't free enough to make a video on 1.09 because I feel like my initial thoughts and feelings on the patch ended up being pretty different now that I've played with it a bit. Initially, everyone seemed really positive about it, with the changes to greatswords and curved greatswords, but as more people dug into it, they found the patch notes themselves to be kinda inaccurate, and also full of... Oh. My cat is getting fed now. Like I was saying, the patch was full of stealth nerfs, buffs to things that didn't really need buffing, and also newly introduced bugs. I'm not sure if FromSoft is just leaning into their obscure form of storytelling with this latest patch, but we had to kind of piece together exactly what this patch actually did and didn't do, like DS3 lore tubers trying to figure out who Velko was. So I have a whole section of this video dedicated to my thoughts on 1.09 and what the point of that patch really was, but I really wanted to talk more about the character that this video features first and foremost. Because in a lot of ways I feel like this character symbolizes the new approach to build making that I'm slowly starting to develop with this game, especially as things continue to evolve with these current patches. 1.09 has really forced me to change my build making mindset, and that's not a bad thing, and that's what this Age of Reflection is all about. But I think it's safe to say that the Age of Mage is truly over and altered in a dramatic way. 1.09 basically made at least half of my past build videos totally irrelevant, and thus we must continue to reflect, adapt, and explore how we make our own fun in this game. This is the Hanged Heretic, a dragon caster. The lore behind this build is that this was once a Leyndell Dragon Knight, who delved too deeply into the arcane aspects of the dragons and began to sprout horns and appendages, basically on the path to becoming a strange dragon hybrid person, like King Osiris or the Man-Serpents of Dark Souls 3. But like in so many instances with the Golden Order, our character was branded an abomination and a traitor, and crucified for his heresy, hence the name of Hanged Heretic, and also the wearing of the Guilty Hood. I also really like the combination of Guilty Hood and Altered Drake Knight chest. There's something about the way that the little bib fits over it all. It's a little goofy, but it all kind of works together. The overall premise of this build is that it's an arcane and faith build that derives its weapon damage largely from faith and scales its spells with both faith and arcane. It's basically the natural evolution of the Bloodstar Worshipper, but with a focus on dragon incantations instead of briar spells and bleedouts. Essentially, I got really tired of trying to make bloodcasters work since overlevels in this game don't really bleed. They do, however, still die, and Dragonclaw is proof of that. Dragonclaw is my overleveled smasher and invasion ender, and boy do I love it. Also, all of the footage that you're seeing here in the first half of the video or so was recorded in 1.08, Some of the damage numbers here are going to be a little different in 1.09 after I made some tweaks, and also after the game fundamentally changed a bit. Yes, that's just how patches work. Looking at my stats, you might think that it's a terrible idea to go for a 30-30 split, basically, on Faith and Arcane at this rune level, and for many other stat spreads, you'd be right. But the spell buff that you get at +8 on the Dragon Communion Seal with those stats is shockingly good. And then add that to the fact that spells like Greyoll's Roar and Dragonclaw get a 15% boost from the Communion Seal, it actually makes more sense than you'd think. Much like the Bloodstar Worshipper, I'm using Flaming Strike to keep people at a distance so I can hit them with spells, or rather in this case, just incantations. But no matter what you do to Flaming Strike or with Flaming Strike, it will just outright murder some people. Enjoy this compilation of me spawning into the tiny cave right outside of Rykard's and just murdering people with nothing but Flaming Strike, because that's just what that Ash of War does. And a lot of people don't seem to learn after the first Flaming Strike to give you a little bit of distance. No, they stick around for both the first and the second part, which to most players does 900 damage. But let's not focus too much on the Ash of War. It's more important that it's on a Scythe. And Scythes are very, very fun in this game. I have a whole spiel about how if you like having fun in this game, you should just drop halberds and start using Scythes, because they're way more interesting and you can press more buttons than just the running R1. I'll save that spiel for some other time, but for now I'll say this. Scythes are not better than halberds, mind you, but they are more fun, in my opinion at least. I should also talk about my second favorite dragon incantation, Greyoll's Roar. You very rarely see this roar because it kind of has a ridiculous stat requirement of 28 Faith and 17 Arcane, which nobody has, as well as requiring 2 attunement slots. That being said, it has an enormous hitbox that is very difficult to see, routinely does around 600 damage to your opponents, and also applies a minute-long debuff to all enemies around you that lowers their AR and increases their damage taken. I don't think it has any real hyper armor. I think it has some very light ones, maybe, but it can't get through much, so I would not recommend trading with this weapon. But it does go through walls and around corners very easily. If you're ever at the top of a ladder with Greyoll's Roar, you basically own that ladder now. Seriously, people should not climb up, and if they do continue to climb up that ladder, they will die. It's also the world's greatest wake-up. If you've landed a critical attack on your opponent, just stand over them and cast the Roar. I legitimately don't think there's any escaping from it, unless you already have something like Bloodhound Step equipped, and time it perfectly. My cat has started eating, so we're just gonna record right on through this. So, one thing I confirmed for certain on this build is that I love the spell Frenzied Burst. I mean, it's simple to dodge, has almost zero tracking of any sort, and has a long startup compared to many other incantations. But man, do I love this spell. So Saint Riot once said in a Dark Souls 3 video about verticality, and I'm paraphrasing here, the first thing you do is greet a party with a friendly little wave. Don't be surprised to be met with boots kicking in your teeth. So instead, greet the party with a plunging attack and watch them scurry like so much rat. That's at least how I remember it. It might be accurate, it might not be, but that's just how I remember that video. Anyways, I didn't do any research for this video. Anyways. So in Dark Souls 3, a lot of the time you could perform a plunging attack. Plunging attacks kind of suck in this game. But you could also, in Dark Souls 3, shoot them in the face with a great bow. Or what I like to do was put on the Untrue White Ring, cast Hidden Body, and backstab the ever-living crap out of a phantom. But I've been missing that same sort of thing in Elden Ring. Yes, I know the Jar Cannon exists. No, not all of my builds have 20 strength to use it. But who really needs a Jar Cannon when you have a sniper rifle in the form of an incantation? Now when I enter an invasion and spot the party, the first thing I do is lay a big fat frenzied burst on them, like a friendly, wet, madness-inducing kiss on the mouth. So many invasions now start with sniper battles where mages charge up their Loretta's Greatbow or whatever long-range projectile they think they're going to hit me with. And meanwhile, I'm proccing madness in 2 hits from Frenzied Burst. Frenzied Burst is fun and all, but I also wanted a way to top off my opponent's madness bar, so I turned to an Endurable Frenzy. Initially I was very intrigued by it. I liked the idea of being able to cast this spell while walking and moving around. However, I've noticed that it has some really random gaps in its spray, like instances where I was sure I would be hitting my opponents, but the madness just wasn't proccing. This of course was due to something that always happens with me and status effect builds, is that I get tunnel vision on proccing the status effect to the point where it causes me to lose an invasion, or to sometimes just ruin what would have been a very fun and stylish clip just because I was so focused on getting a madness proc or a bleed proc or whatever. Also, that last burst that Unendurable Frenzy does where it turns you into a sprinkler of madness is just pretty useless. I find myself almost never hitting anyone with that last spray, and there's no way to cancel out of it, so you're just stuck there doing this crazy animation until either everyone that you're firing this at runs away or someone whacks you out of the animation. And lastly, the spell is just a huge FP drain, which is just another downside to it really. There are far more efficient and effective FP drain incantations out there. The aspect of the Crucible Breath is one, but there's also Agheel's Flame. On one hand, I feel filthy for using it, but on the other, it does just absolutely smoke this overleveled summon here, which is quite nice. I've always been against Dragon Breath incantations in general, mostly due to their reach, ridiculous hitbox, and lack of actual skill to use. But I'm also torn because this build specifically is optimized to use them really well. Ultimately, I resolve not to use the breaths, but the other dragon incantations are very much on the table and are very much viable. I will also add that the spell order on this build needed a lot of fiddling around and tweaking. I kept using spells that I thought were fun or unique or hard to get, but it took a little reflection to determine that some spells, while interesting, are just functionally useless for this build. I kept trying to make some of the arcane incantations like Blood Boon or Swarm of Bees work, but ultimately this was just not going to be a build that bleeds people out. Something you might have noticed is that the majority of these incantations do fire damage, which is also boosted by the Flame Shrouding Crack tier, and that all works in synergy with the Flame Art infusion on the Scythe and Flaming Strike. That is, until 1.09 arrived and changed things. One of the things that 1.09 tweaked was a nerf to the 4 Shrouding Crack tiers. Those tiers are an ingredient that you can mix into your Physic that would boost one type of elemental damage by 15% in PvP. That 15% has been lowered to 5 in 1.09, making it essentially useless, which is just beyond frustrating for me. I think I understand why FromSoft did it. They're trying to prevent people from stacking damage with a million 15% body buffs, which, mind you, is definitely its own issue. But it really doesn't solve the main issue that the damage in this game is still way too damn high, and thus the time to kill overall is bizarrely low for a FromSoft game. And all this nerf really accomplishes is that now mid-range elemental builds struggle to output the kind of damage they needed to kill or even just to stop overleveled summons. And overleveled summons still obliterate everyone and everything at mid-level because downscaling is still busted. That's not to say that now mid-level invasions are no longer viable, because they definitely still are, but it does mean that mages for that level took a pretty hard nerf, and the time of being cute at mid-level is just plain over. What bumps me out the most about the tier nerf is that the tier was a really creative parameter to meet for my builds, where I would try to unify all of my damage to one type so that almost all of my damage would benefit from one kind of cracked tier. This would mean I could get a couple of different sources of the same damage type and make them all work together on one build. That was half of the premise of Whirling Redwin, where the magic damage of the Mariah's Greatsword and the magic damage of my spells from the Albinaric Staff would synergize. I was basically running a magic damage build that entirely scaled with Arcane. That's at least how I was approaching build making before the patch, but now I have to rethink things. Part of the patch was that they also buffed the scaling of a lot of infusions in general, so builds didn't have to rely so hard on those magic shrouding tiers to get good damage at, higher weapon upgrades. So I was initially quite upset over the shrouding tier nerfs, but in a way it also kind of liberated me from that restriction. Like I said before, a lot of those spells were chosen just because they did fire damage, not necessarily because they fit the general or overall aesthetic of this build. Which is also silly because if you looked at the footage thus far, most of my effective spells have largely been Dragonclaw and Greyoll's Roar, two spells that do purely physical damage. So then I started layering in other spells that weren't fire related. I got rid of Blood Boon and Flame Fall Upon them because they didn't really add anything to this build and had longer cast times to boot. I replaced them with things like Lightning Strike and Lightning Bolt because after all I am a dragon caster and dragons seem to have strong ties to lightning in this game, which is in stark contrast to the Dark Souls series. In fact, I should play around with some of these other lightning incantations a little bit more, especially those red lightning ones or even Dragon Bolt. We'll see what I end up landing on, but I've had my eye on Lanciax's Glaive for quite some time. I know it's not that great, but could be cool. Not a lot of these builds that I make are that great, they're just kinda cool. That's not to say that I've gone away entirely from fire damage, since I still did want a few more Frenzied incantations. I ended up replacing Unendurable Frenzy with good old regular Flame of Frenzy, and also slapping on Howl of Shabriri at the tail end of my spell list. I've definitely talked about Flame of Frenzy before, but just to reiterate, I also love this spell. It's got a fairly short cast speed, pretty decent damage, but best of all, it has incredible hit stun. Like I have a clip here of stunning someone out of their Bloodhound's Finesse, which we all know at this point has some fairly significant hyper armor on it. With Flaming Strike, Greyoll's Roar, and Flame of Frenzy, this build pretty much completely dominates tight spaces. Insert the Rorschach, I'm not locked in here with you, you're locked in here with me meme. Which I don't really like. I don't really like that meme because everyone always cites the lousy adaptation that Zack Snyder did of Watchmen. And that's what they're referring to because that YouTube clip has millions of views on YouTube. Anyways, I digress. The fact that this character is good at close quarters is fantastic because builds like the Astral Rogue really struggled in tight spaces like catacombs and caves. That build really thrived in the open world, being able to ping opponents with high damaging, long range spells, and then rolling away with light roll when the distance was closed. The Hanged Heretic, on the other hand, wants to get in a small room and maul his opponents to death with his Dragon Claws. His spells have hyper armor, hit stun, and the ability to output some insanely close range damage. And if all that fails, there's always Flaming Strike. Along with the changes that I made to the spellcasting, I tweaked my stats around to give myself more endurance and poise up a little bit better. I also overhauled my Physic tier, Fire Shrouding tier is now gone due to the nerf, and now I'm using the Faith Knot, which gives me plus 10 Faith. I think it was Stochastic who pointed out to me that having plus 10 in another stat like Faith or Strength has added benefits beyond just increased damage. It also boosts your defenses. And since 1.09 also made infusion scaling quite a bit better, the plus 10 goes a lot further than it did before in terms of damage. And lastly, after a year of avoiding the Crimson Bubble tier, I have succumbed to the Siren Song of Liquid Second Chance. I never really wanted to use this because whenever I saw gameplay or streams of Demon Souls, everybody was using Second Chance all the goddamn time, and at meta level in Dark Souls 3, everyone had Tears of Denial, which I also strongly disliked. But with the insanely low time to kill of Elden Ring's PvP, the Crimson Bubble becomes a way for me to play a lot looser and more stylish without having to be constantly worried about getting obliterated in less than a second. I don't have to just fall back on my kill or be killed instincts that this game instills in its players, and drives them towards only the most efficient killing tools. Essentially, the Crimson Bubble allows me to be cute right up until that bubble gets popped, which is still a significantly longer period of time of being cute than before. And being able to play with more style, in my opinion, is always a net positive. So, patch 1.09 has some good, has some bad, but overall I'm still pretty negative about it, because FromSoft still has not touched their entirely broken downscaling algorithm for summon players. And it'd be one thing if overleveled summons just were supposed to be more powerful by design. But as many in the Souls PvP community like Stochastic and Jerp have shown, The algorithm simply ignores certain values in its attempt to downscale. One of many examples is that arcane scaling for status effects just doesn't downscale. So if you ever get insta-bled out by something like Rivers of Blood or a singular power stance curved sword running attack from an overleveled summon, that's why. But it's not just status effects, it's everything. Here I have 45 Vigor, no source heal, and I get hit by a singular uncharged Giant's Flame take V. Instant death. All of my health. Like, do I deserve to take a lot of damage for getting hit by that? Absolutely. Should this be something that one-shots, even with a decent investment in Vigor? Yeah, probably not. Even during the Era event, we had a few meta-level players who crashed the event using the event password to match with us rune level 60 players, and there was an extremely noticeable difference between the event crashers and the honest players. Even with downscaling, their damage was absurd, 3 to 4 shotting most players with simple, heavy thrusting sword R1s, and only taking a fraction of that damage from other players because absorptions and defense values aren't downscaled properly. And to make all these matters dramatically worse, for some reason on PC, connections with just people's summons have grown dramatically worse in the last few months. When you experience connection issues, it's often a good idea to take a step back and think like, hey, do I have a bad connection with everyone that I encounter? Because if that's true, it means there's likely something wrong with your internet. But what's frustrating about this is that I'll have quite a few invasions where I have a great connection with the host, but just an abysmal connection with the summon, where my damage simply does not register for several seconds after I inflict it. So that, in combination with the broken downscaling and, the whole passive poise thing, means for every fun clip you see here, there's another clip that I didn't save of me just getting obliterated by an overleveled summon because none of my hits trying to abate their aggression register until I'm already dead. I had been really hoping FromSoft would fix that particular issue, which I highly suspect is server side, but for now we'll just have to deal with it. Sometimes all I can do is just run away from an overleveled phantom, and it is what it is. I'll just have to deal with it. It seems like in general with this patch that the focus was really on balancing at the meta and arena levels rather than the mid-level invasions. My main evidence for this is the two things I just talked about, the broken down scaling algorithm and connections with individual summons performing poorly, which are both things that are in general very uncommon to occur in the arena or let's say like at meta main academy gate. But the other piece of evidence that I feel like is in my favor of this theory about balancing towards meta and duels is what they did to some of the infusions in this game. They buffed the lightning infusion, which was really odd to me considering that it was already the best infusion in terms of raw damage for mid-level invasions. Sure, cold infusions are good, but man, you could just stack lightning damage and absolutely melt people at rune level 60 pre 1.09, and now it's even better. So I felt like them buffing the things that they did was just their attempt to get people to use like certain weapons or certain infusions more in duels, which I understand, but it's really not what I feel like this game needs right now. But you know me, I'm extremely biased and love my mid-level invasions, and quite honestly don't really care about meta duels or like what happens in the arena in the slightest. It's just not very important to me. Because now what you have is that old Dark Souls 3 argument of like, oh, we need to twink because overleveled summons at lower levels are just impossible to beat. And now I feel like that mentality doesn't apply to low level, and it's not really twinking anymore. It's just like now you have to have something mean that can deal with two people at once on almost every build. You kind of have to have that find out sword at the ready on every single build, and sometimes it's exhausting. It's exhausting to make builds that are able to take on two people standing around in a field not doing anything, or very often three. So that's all to say, I'm still having fun with the game. This patch wasn't all bad, it just changed things. I'm not very broken up about the shrouding tier nerf at the end of the day. I'm actually pretty open to it and excited to start expanding my horizons on different types of builds. Age of Mage, kind of dead, but that doesn't mean we're dropping spells. I think spells are still insanely useful and probably the best they've ever been since Dark Souls 2 in this game. And I fully intend to keep taking advantage of them. But anyways, guys, that's all for me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.